Every night on a cruise, right around sunset, something flips on that wasn't running an hour earlier. The casino lights up, the slot machines start chiming, and it has almost nothing to do with atmosphere. It has everything to do with an invisible legal line the ship just crossed, one most passengers never notice, and one that explains a lot more about your cruise schedule than you'd expect. Let's start with the myth, because almost everyone assumes cruise ships sail overnight simply to save time, covering distance while everyone sleeps, so the ship arrives fresh at the next port by morning. That's true, technically, but it's not really the reason. It's more like a convenient side effect of something far more deliberate. The real driver is money, and specifically where a cruise line is legally allowed to make it. It's a nice, tidy explanation, the kind that shows up in most travel blogs answering this exact question, and it isn't wrong so much as incomplete. Here's the detail that changes everything. Cruise ship casinos cannot legally operate inside a country's territorial waters, generally defined as roughly 12 nautical miles from shore in places like the United States. Step aboard in Miami or Fort Lauderdale, and you'll notice the casino sitting there completely dark, lights off, machines silent, even though everything else on the ship is fully running. It's not a staffing issue or a scheduling quirk. It's federal and maritime law. The moment the ship crosses that 12-mile boundary and enters international waters, the casino comes alive almost instantly, governed suddenly by the laws of whatever country the ship happens to be flagged under instead of the country the passengers just left. Officers monitor GPS constantly to know exactly when that legal switch gets flipped, because opening early is a genuine regulatory violation, not just bad form. The flag itself matters more than most passengers realize, too. Once a ship crosses that boundary, it is not operating under some neutral, lawless void. It is operating under the legal code of whatever nation it is registered to, and cruise lines choose that registration deliberately. Panama, the Bahamas, and Liberia are three of the most common choices across the entire industry, not because of anything to do with those countries themselves, but because their maritime regulations tend to be more permissive and predictable for exactly this kind of onboard commercial activity. It is why the minimum gambling age on one ship might be 18, while the minimum on another, sailing from the very same American port, is 21, depending entirely on which flag happens to be flying off the stern. The logic gets even more transparent when you look at so-called cruises to nowhere, short round-trip sailings, sometimes just a few hours long, that exist almost entirely to give passengers legal access to a casino. Popular for decades across parts of Asia, these trips do not bother visiting a destination at all. The ship simply leaves port, sails far enough to clear territorial waters, opens the casino, lets everyone play for a set number of hours, and turns around. Strip away the destinations, the excursions, and the pretense of a vacation itinerary, and what is left is the purest version of the same incentive driving every overnight sailing on a normal cruise. Time spent legally outside a coastline is time the ship can legally profit from gamming. This isn't a new trick, either. Gambling ships have been exploiting exactly this loophole since the 1930s, when operators anchored converted barges just past what was then a 3-mile territorial limit off the coast of California, ferrying gamblers out by water taxi to dodge state anti-gambling laws entirely. When international law later extended territorial waters out to 12 miles in the early 1980s, it made that old model far less practical. Permanently moored ships suddenly needed to sit 4 times farther offshore. Modern cruise lines solved the same underlying problem in a completely different way. Instead of anchoring a stationary casino far out at sea, they simply built the casino into a ship that was already going to be sailing that far out anyway, as part of its actual itinerary. California's own Attorney General at the time eventually ordered raids on several of these floating casinos, boarding them by force to shut the operations down, which only underscores how seriously authorities took what was, even then, viewed as a deliberate attempt to dodge the law by the width of a few miles of open water. On a typical sea day, some casinos run around the clock, floor-to-ceiling activity from morning until the early hours of the next day, while on a port day, the same room stays dark until roughly an hour after departure, then runs late into the night to make up for lost time. So think about what that legal boundary actually means for a ship's daily schedule. If a cruise line wants its casino open for as many hours as possible, and it absolutely does, since gaming and onboard spending are enormous profit centers, the ship needs to spend as much time as possible outside that 12-mile. And the easiest, most efficient way to guarantee hours and hours of international water time without sacrificing a single hour of daylight in port is to do exactly what cruise ships do. Depart in the evening, sail through the night, arrive at the next destination the following morning, all while the casino, bars, and specialty restaurants stay open and profitable the entire time. It's a schedule built backward from a legal boundary rather than forward from a map, which is a strange way to plan a vacation itinerary until you realize how much money is riding on getting it exactly right. If you're the kind of person who notices when a system is quietly optimized for revenue and not just convenience, you're exactly who this channel is for. The like button takes 1 second and genuinely helps. But the casino is really just the most visible piece of a much bigger financial puzzle. Roughly 60% of a cruise line's total revenue comes from the ticket you already paid for, but the remaining chunk, and disproportionately more of the actual profit margin, comes from everything you buy once you're already on board. On a large ship sailing at full capacity, a single 7-day voyage can generate well over $9 million in total revenue, with onboard spending alone contributing a meaningful share of that. After overhead, a cruise line can walk away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure profit from one sailing per week, per ship, across an entire fleet running the same model simultaneously. Specialty dining, drink packages, spa treatments, art auctions, and the casino all depend entirely on passengers being physically present on the ship rather than off exploring a port town. That onboard spending has only grown more important to the industry's bottom line in recent years. Cruise executives have openly discussed on earnings calls how passengers who pre-book specialty dining, drink packages, and excursions before ever stepping aboard end up spending roughly 2.5 times more overall than passengers who don't, and every one of those categories depends on the passenger being on the ship, not off wandering a foreign city. Scale that up across an entire global fleet, and the major publicly traded cruise companies collectively pull in tens of billions of dollars in revenue every year, a business large enough that shaving even a small percentage more out of each passenger's nightly spending translates into real money at the corporate level. And here's the part that matters. During the day, in port, passengers are off spending money at local shops, restaurants, and excursion operators, none of which puts a single dollar back into the cruise line's own revenue. That creates a strange incentive most passengers never think about. Cruise lines genuinely want you ashore during daylight hours, at least enough to keep the ports themselves happy, viable, and worth returning to season after season, since a port that stops seeing tourist spending eventually stops welcoming cruise ships altogether. But once the sun goes down and the ship pulls away, that entire dynamic flips completely. Now, every hour you're awake and on board is an hour you might be at the specialty steakhouse, ordering another round at the pool bar, or feeding money into a slot machine that, by the way, typically pays out noticeably less than a machine in Las Vegas would, often somewhere around 80 to 90% compared to the low to mid-90s on land, since it isn't subject to the same regulatory transparency requirements once it's operating on the open ocean. Land-based casinos in places like Nevada or New Jersey are legally required to publish their payout percentages for public verification. Ships flagged in more permissive jurisdictions face no such requirement, which is part of why a slot machine at sea can quietly run a noticeably tighter margin than the one you'd find in a Vegas airport terminal. Ports themselves aren't naive about any of this either. Cruise lines typically pay a modest head tax, often somewhere between $4 and $15 per passenger, just for the privilege of calling at a given destination. And in many cases, the cruise line negotiates a cut of the revenue generated by local vendors and excursion operators, too, sometimes as much as 70% of what a local tour company or gift shop takes in from cruise passengers. So even the daytime hours ashore, the hours that look like pure goodwill toward the destination, are often quietly generating revenue for the cruise line as well, just through a completely different channel than the casino. That arrangement explains why destinations keep welcoming ship after ship, even when locals sometimes grumble about crowding. The math, from the port side of the ledger, still tends to work out in their favor often enough to keep the relationship going year after year. Now here's where the picture gets even more precise. Sail away parties, the loud, music-filled deck gatherings that happen the moment a ship leaves port aren't just a fun tradition. They're specifically timed to happen right as the ship re-enters international waters, drawing a captive audience toward the pool deck bars at the exact moment the casino, just one deck below, is legally allowed to reopen for the night. It's genuinely choreographed, even if it doesn't feel that way when you're holding a frozen drink and watching the coastline shrink behind. There's also a straightforward cost side to this equation that reinforces everything else. Docking a large ship isn't free. Port authorities charge fees that scale with a vessel's size and how long it stays, and every extra hour tied up at a berth means paying for tugboats, longshoremen, security, and dock space that could otherwise be avoided by simply being out at sea instead. Combine that with the fact that ships burn noticeably less fuel cruising at a steady, efficient speed overnight than they would idling and maneuvering in and out of a crowded harbor during the day, and overnight transit starts looking less like a lifestyle choice and more like the financially obvious option. Many harbors also have practical arrival windows shaped by tides, pilot availability, and berth scheduling, meaning a predictable, unhurried overnight transit is often simply the smoothest way to guarantee an on-time morning arrival, rather than a rushed one squeezed into daylight hours. Every port negotiates its own arrangement with each cruise line, but the general pattern holds everywhere. Bigger ships staying longer cost more, in raw docking fees and in the lost opportunity of a casino floor and 3 bars sitting idle for hours that could otherwise be generating revenue out at sea. Many harbor channels are simply easier and safer to navigate in daylight too, with visible markers, other vessel traffic, and shallow water hazards far easier to judge by eye than by instruments alone, which gives port authorities another reason to prefer morning arrivals and encourages cruise lines to time their overnight transit precisely enough to arrive right as the sun comes up. Some cruise lines have taken this logic even further in recent years, deliberately trimming port hours rather than extending them. The thinking is almost the mirror image of the overnight sailing strategy. A long, open-ended afternoon in port tends to scatter passengers across a destination with no real pullback toward the ship, what industry insiders sometimes call a dead afternoon, generating essentially nothing for onboard revenue. A tighter port window paired with a later, more festive sail away keeps that captive audience closer to the moment spending actually starts counting again. It's a small adjustment on paper, sometimes just an hour or two trimmed off a published itinerary, but multiplied across hundreds of sailings a year, it adds up to a measurable shift in exactly where passenger spending ends up landing. It's worth noting the industry isn't monolithic on this. A handful of lines have recently started experimenting with longer port stays and genuine overnight calls, letting passengers experience a destination after dark instead of racing back to the ship by sunset. But those remain the exception precisely because they work against the financial logic driving everything else, and they tend to show up on smaller, more expensive, destination-focused itineraries rather than the mainstream mass-market cruises most people actually book. One line recently rolled out nearly 30 double overnight port stays across its fleet in a single year, pairing them with hundreds of new after-dark excursions built specifically around guests staying ashore into the east. It's a genuinely different business model built around slower, more immersive travel rather than maximizing hours at sea, and it tends to come with a noticeably higher price tag to match. None of this requires anyone to trick you into spending money, either. It's simpler than that. Once the ship pulls away from a port at dusk, there's genuinely nowhere else to go and nothing else to spend money on except what's already on board, which is exactly the point. The destination gets its daylight hours, the ship gets the rest, and the rest just happens to be when people are most relaxed, most social, and most likely to order one more round. Put all of that together, and overnight sailing stops looking like a scheduling convenience and starts looking like something closer to a business model. Daylight hours get allocated to the destination, keeping ports profitable partners worth returning to season after season. Then, nighttime hours, the exact hours when the casino can legally operate, when specialty restaurants are fullest, when the bars do the bulk of their business, get allocated almost entirely back to the ship itself. It isn't a coincidence that these two schedules line up as neatly as they do. It's closer to careful design, refined across an entire industry over decades of scheduling data and passenger spending patterns. Even the parts of a cruise that feel the most spontaneous, the live band on the pool deck, the sudden rush toward the casino entrance, the specialty restaurant somehow fully booked by 8, trace back to the same quiet calculation made months in advance by people who never once appear in the daily schedule handed to your cabin. So the next time you're standing at the rail watching a port disappear behind the ship right around dinner time, know what's actually happening a few decks below you. Somewhere on the bridge, an officer just watched a GPS readout cross an invisible line in the water, and somewhere below that, a casino floor just came back to life, right on schedule, exactly as it was destined to. It's a schedule built backward from a legal boundary rather than forward from a map, and that's the kind of hidden logic this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe, because next video looks at the one moment where a cruise ship's entire safety system, its crew, its technology, its legal obligations, actually gets tested. What really happens if someone goes overboard, and why the honest answer depends on a piece of technology most ships still don't carry.